It's a quiet, almost imperceptible behavior that governs a vast portion of modern human relationships, though most remain unaware. This is the compulsion to constantly explain oneself. On the surface, it's a habit that appears innocuous, even courteous. After all, providing justifications for your decisions, your feelings, your whereabouts, or your shifting moods can mimic the sound of empathy and consideration for others. Yet concealed beneath this perpetual need for justification is something far more profound and unsettling, a psychological wound that has never properly healed. Carl Gustav Jung, a towering figure in analytical psychology, recognized this pattern as a distinct symptom of a person's disconnection from their true self. For him, the relentless effort to persuade others of who you are, what you're feeling, and the reasons for your actions is, in fact, a revelation of profound self-neglect. An individual who is perpetually explaining is often searching for something they were never given: permission to simply exist. This behavior frequently originates in environments marked by emotional invalidation. These are contexts, often within families, where a child's subjective experience is systematically negated. "That's ridiculous, you're overreacting. There's no reason to feel that way." The internalized message is severe. What I feel holds weight only if it is understood, approved, or allowed by someone else. Over time, this belief calcifies into an invisible cage, where the individual grows dependent on others' comprehension to affirm their own internal reality. When an adult compulsively explains, they are subconsciously attempting to fend off abandonment, judgment, or rejection. They operate under the belief that if others could just grasp their reasons, perhaps they wouldn't be criticized, wouldn't be pushed away, wouldn't be dismissed. It represents a desperate attempt to manage the perceptions of others to secure belonging and emotional safety. However, this relentless striving comes at a significant cost: one's own psychological autonomy. By fixating on external validation, the individual starts to disregard their own internal authority. They no longer act from a place of conviction, but from a need to justify themselves to evade being misunderstood. They can no longer experience emotions freely. Instead, they rationalize them to avoid the discomfort of a negative perception. Little by little, they stop living for themselves and start performing for others, in a perpetual theater where the audience wields more power than the protagonist. Jung saw this phenomenon as a key impediment on the path of individuation, the process by which a person genuinely becomes themselves. And the reality is stark. As long as the constant need to explain oneself persists, inner freedom cannot exist. Compulsive explanation is a refined form of submission. With each justification, it is as if the individual is saying, "I am only allowed to exist if you permit it." This video is a call to dismantle this conditioning, a deep look into why so many people are trapped by the need to justify themselves and what occurs when they finally embrace silence. When they choose to stop explaining, a radical shift occurs. The psyche, once bowed to external approval, starts to straighten with a new posture, that of inner authority. And this changes everything. Behind the compulsion to explain lies something far deeper than politeness or a simple wish to be understood. It is a psychic wound, lodged in the very core of one's identity. Jung saw that this urge for self-explanation is more than a behavioral tic. It is a symptom, a manifestation of something much older, the unconscious conviction that one's existence is only valuable when validated by others. This injury often forms early in childhood, in settings where a child's subjectivity is repeatedly delegitimized. When a child expresses sorrow and is told they are being dramatic, when they show rage and are labeled difficult or disobedient, when they admit to being afraid and are met with scorn or irony, they begin to absorb a dangerous message. What I feel is incorrect. I can only rely on the reactions of others. Eventually, the child builds a defense mechanism, attempting to be understood in order to feel secure. They learn that a well-articulated explanation for their feelings might spare them from punishment, neglect, or ridicule. From this, a pattern is born that follows them into adulthood, justifying every emotion, decision, and attitude, as though a compelling argument is required for the right to feel and to be. At the heart of this wound is the forfeiture of internal authority. The person no longer regards themselves as someone whose experience is inherently valid. They become dependent on the external gaze to confirm whether their life has legitimacy. This fosters a psychological state of deference, where self-worth isn't built from within, but is constructed from the reflection seen in others' eyes. It's crucial to see that this dynamic is not conscious. Frequently, those caught in this pattern are unaware that they are constantly trying to convince others that their emotions are logical, their choices are sound, and their actions have a motive. But beneath every explanation is a hidden fear, the fear of being cast out for simply being themselves. Jung maintained that every person, at some point, must confront this inherited internal framework. Until they do, they continue to function according to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from authority figures like parents, teachers, or spiritual leaders. The individual becomes a mirror of what others would approve of, rather than a reflection of their true self. This compulsive need to explain is, therefore, a mode of self-abandonment. It is the act of betraying one's own truth to make it more acceptable to others. And it is at this very point that the healing journey starts. Recognizing that you no longer need to request permission to exist, that your emotions, no matter how intense, conflicting, or unusual, do not require justification to deserve space. But this realization does not come without pain. As an individual begins to quiet the urge to justify, the resulting silence is unnerving, for it exposes the void left by the lack of a solidified inner authority. And this is exactly what Jung addresses when he introduces a cornerstone of his psychology, the construction of internal authority. In the next section, we will delve into how this concept, vital to the Jungian process of individuation, can fundamentally alter how one stands in the world. What is entailed in developing internal authority? And why is it the key to breaking free from the cycle of self-explanation? Compulsive self-explanation is not merely a defense mechanism. It is a continuous act of self-betrayal. It is a quiet, often imperceptible, yet deeply corrosive betrayal. Carl Jung saw that each time an individual tailors their words to avoid displeasure, conceals their emotions for the sake of harmony, or suppresses their decisions to escape judgment, they move further from themselves. They are effectively forsaking their own truth. This internal betrayal isn't a single explosive event. Instead, it is subtle, gradual, and daily. It happens when you laugh at something unfunny to appear sociable, when you agree when you mean to decline to avoid seeming selfish, when you pass off your sadness as fatigue so as not to be a burden, when you feel rage but mask it with reason, fearing you'll look immature. With every small compromise made for the sake of acceptance, a piece of the soul is left behind. Jung noted that this type of behavior is a direct reflection of an ego that is disconnected from the self. The ego, which should function as the center of consciousness, instead becomes a servant to external approval. It reshapes itself into what others wish to see. And through this constant adaptation, the individual loses contact with their inner being. They stop heeding their own intuition, distrust their own feelings, and second-guess their most authentic motives. Doubt replaces inner certainty. This process of self-abandonment is insidious because it is often socially rewarded. People who are accommodating, who know how to justify themselves, who sidestep conflict, who are easy to be around, are often praised. But this false harmony frequently hides a deep emotional exhaustion, the fatigue of someone living for others who can no longer hear their own voice. Jung argued that this internal fragmentation is a primary source of neuroses. When the ego strays too far from the self, the symbolic core of psychic wholeness, symptoms emerge: chronic anxiety, existential crises, feelings of emptiness, indecisiveness, and low self-esteem. The reason? The soul is crying out to be heard, but has been silenced for the sake of social adaptation. Ultimately, the crucial question is this: whose life are you living? As long as you perpetually seek validation to feel, think, or act, your existence remains a performance, an edited version of your truth. You will remain a character in another's story, never the author of your own. The only way to escape this cycle of self-betrayal is to reclaim your internal authority. It means cultivating the ability to stand by your truth even when it isn't understood, causes discomfort, or defies expectations. This marks the start of true individuation, becoming whole, even if it means disappointing someone else. But how does one cultivate this internal authority? How do you stop relying on external understanding to affirm your being? How do you remain silent when pressured for an explanation? This is precisely what Jung addresses with his concept of individuation, and we will explore it next, because only when this authority is established does silence shift from absence to affirmation. For Carl Jung, genuine psychological freedom doesn't come from social acceptance or external understanding. It arises from the cultivation of internal authority. This concept, fundamental to his theory of individuation, signifies an individual's capacity to validate their own subjective experience without needing the endorsement of others. It is the moment you shift from asking, "Will they understand how I feel?" to affirming, "It doesn't matter if they understand. This is true for me." Internal authority is the antithesis of compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is rooted in insecurity, the need to justify each move to be accepted, internal authority stems from the deep-seated conviction that your truth is not up for negotiation. This is not just an intellectual shift, it's existential. The psyche's center of gravity moves. It shifts from the periphery of external approval back to the core of the self, the seat of one's total being. But this transition isn't easy. It demands courage. By ceasing to explain yourself, you directly face the fear of abandonment, judgment, and exclusion. Jung wrote that individuation requires crossing the desert of inner solitude. It's the moment you, for the first time, hold a no without guilt, when you don't justify changing your mind, when you end a conversation without explaining why, not from arrogance, but because you owe no one an explanation for your existence. Developing this authority doesn't mean becoming callous or closed off. Rather, it means you no longer need to plead for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not a desperate bid for acceptance. Communication is no longer a performance. It becomes an authentic expression. It is the difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. In daily life, internal authority appears in small gestures, in maintaining silence amidst provocation, in the firmness of saying, "That does not resonate with me," without needing to elaborate, in refusing to engage in emotional games where you must always defend your position, and especially in the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood and still feel complete. Jung saw this as one of the most critical junctures in the psychological journey. The instant an individual stops outsourcing their self-worth and begins to recognize it as something that emerges from within. This transition is both symbolic and potent, as it marks a break from the old, conditioned self that lives to please and signals the birth of a new, rooted, autonomous, and whole self. But this new posture isn't always welcomed. The silence that comes from internal authority is often disturbing to others. People who once benefited from your insecurity start to lose their leverage. Manipulators feel challenged. Relationships built on power imbalances begin to disintegrate. And that is exactly why, when you stop explaining, everything changes. Silence, when it comes from integrity rather than evasion, is one of the psyche's most transformative forces. Jung understood this with sharp clarity. He perceived silence not as a lack of response, but as a presence of authority. When a person ceases to justify themselves compulsively, they aren't just dodging conflicts or ending conversations. They are shutting down an entire system of psychological control that thrived on their insecurity. This kind of silence is unsettling. For those accustomed to you yielding, explaining, and correcting yourself, the absence of justification feels like an act of rebellion. And in a way, it is. But it's not an immature rebellion that shouts for attention. It is a silent revolution, an implicit declaration that I owe no explanations for being who I am. Manipulative individuals who prey on others' self-doubt start to lose their power. Emotional manipulation only succeeds when there is a perceived vulnerability, a fear of being misunderstood, abandoned, or disappointing. Manipulation requires a reaction, but the secure silence born from internal authority is a stone wall. It doesn't react, it doesn't justify, it doesn't play along, it simply exists, and this presence destabilizes any attempt at control. Furthermore, relationships that relied on your emotional, intellectual, or behavioral submission begin to show their true colors, fragile, one-sided, and based on imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you terminate the implicit contract of inferiority. You stop positioning yourself as someone who needs acceptance and start occupying the space of someone who already accepts themselves. This changes everything. Some people will drift away. This isn't a sign of failure but of realignment. Your silence starts to act as a filter. It separates those who were with you for genuine affinity from those who were there because you were easy to manage. Jung believed that the process of individuation often necessitates ruptures. This distancing is not a punishment. It is liberation. By no longer justifying your presence, boundaries, and choices, you begin to attract relationships founded on mutual respect, not fear or dependency. But you must be prepared because when you stop explaining, you will also have to face your own anxiety. The part of you that learned over decades that you needed to be understood to be worthy will fight back. It will want to revert to old patterns. It will plead with you to reconsider, to explain just one more time. It is in this moment that silence becomes a spiritual practice, a conscious act of staying whole, even when it feels uncomfortable. Silence, then, is not merely the absence of words. It is the affirmation of your being. It is the refusal to put your identity on trial. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it becomes a presence that radiates authority, that commands respect without raising its voice, that sets boundaries without needing a confrontation, a presence that does not require approval to exist. But the impact of silence extends beyond your relationships with others. It triggers a profound process within your own psyche. Integration. When you stop justifying yourself to others, you begin listening to yourself. When you stop rationalizing your emotions, you start to feel them completely. And this is where true transformation is born. External silence creates the space for internal listening. There is something magnetic about a person who feels no need to explain themselves, something that cannot be feigned or forced. It is psychological integrity, the state of someone who no longer barters their essence to meet external expectations. Jung saw this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. When an individual not only knows their truth, but stands in it without hesitation, guilt, or, most importantly, the need for validation. An integrated person doesn't plead to be understood. They communicate, they express, but they do not try to convince because they do not operate from the premise that they must justify their existence. Their words flow from a solid core, not from a hidden deficiency. This alters everything in how they are perceived. The world treats those who treat themselves with respect, with more respect. And self-respect begins the moment you refuse to negotiate what is essential to you. Psychological integrity isn't rigidity, it's coherence. It is the capacity to maintain an internal line of truth, even when facing external pressure. It's when you sense something is off in a situation, and even without a rational explanation, you trust that feeling. You don't need to present evidence or construct elaborate arguments. You can simply say, "This does not feel right for me," and that is sufficient. This stance, seemingly simple, is revolutionary in a world where most people live disconnected from themselves, where choices are based on others' opinions, feelings are dismissed for fear of appearing too sensitive, and boundaries are crossed with forced smiles to avoid seeming difficult. Integrity is the antithesis of this. It is the art of being whole, of not fragmenting yourself to please, of not hiding to avoid conflict. Jung knew that real transformation occurs not when you learn more theories, but when you embody a new stance toward life. And this stance begins with the refusal to justify yourself, because every compulsive justification contains a hidden insecurity. Am I enough? The integrated person no longer asks that question. They know they are, even if the world insists otherwise. And herein lies the paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you command. Integrity has weight, it has density, it has presence. This is why, without uttering a word, a centered person can shift the dynamics of a room. They have nothing to prove. Their internal coherence says it all. People like this do not ask for space, they occupy it. They do not react from insecurity, they act from alignment. But there is a critical detail. This integrity is only possible when you stop betraying yourself. When you stop reshaping yourself to be accepted, when you grant yourself permission to feel, choose, and act, even if no one else understands. This takes practice, presence, and self-knowledge. But above all, it takes the courage to assume responsibility for your own life without blaming others or outsourcing your value. And when this integrity takes root, the effects are profound. Relationships are transformed, your professional posture shifts, your self-perception sharpens, anxiety diminishes, the need to control others' thoughts evaporates. You stop living to be understood and start living to be true. But something even deeper occurs, not just in how you relate to the world, but in what you begin to emanate. When you stop justifying yourself, you radiate a new energy, that of someone in command of themselves. And this energy is unconsciously perceived by everyone around you. This is where the invisible shift happens. The world begins to treat you as someone who does not negotiate. When a person stops explaining themselves, everything changes, not just internally, but externally. It is as if a new frequency is being broadcast. You are no longer saying, "Please understand me." You are emanating, "I know who I am, and I do not need your permission." And the world inevitably responds to this. Jung knew that the human psyche is guided by energy, presence, and internal structure, not by rationalizations. The person who constantly tries to be understood emits a vibration of submission and doubt. The one who no longer explains emits strength, clarity, and authority. This is not about becoming arrogant. It's about finally becoming whole. People start to listen to you differently. Unbalanced relationships no longer make sense. Dynamics where you were once submissive, predictable, and easily controlled simply fall apart. Not because you fought back, but because you are no longer available for that role. Silence reconfigures your relationships because it communicates what you once begged for. It declares, "I am not here to be molded. I am here to be." From that point, you begin to draw in a different kind of connection, deeper, more honest, and more aligned with who you have become. Respect begins from the inside out, and the first step is to stop justifying your own existence. But this journey demands presence. In moments of doubt, the impulse to explain will surface. It will seem safer to please, easier to concede. In those moments, you must remember, every time you withhold an unnecessary explanation, you reaffirm who you are. You strengthen your integrity. You claim your place in the world, not as someone pleading for a spot, but as someone who knows they already belong. So, I invite you to reflect in the comments. What is the one justification you give most often, the one you know, deep down, you no longer wish to provide? Maybe it concerns your emotions, your limits, or your very nature. Writing it down is more than just venting. It's a pivotal moment. And if this message has confronted or inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it with those who explain themselves too much, and subscribe to the channel. The next video is an essential step on this journey. Watch it now. You will see why.